You might expect me to be pretty disappointed that the first dyno session has ended with me pulling the engine out of the Ferrari again, but honestly I'm in a great mood. As Shane from Stuff Made Here says, if at first you don't succeed, just lower your expectations until you are a success, and that's what I've done. Honestly, we've learned a bunch. We've got some teething issues to sort through, the biggest one being the clutch is slipping, which means the engine had to come back out of the car to fix it. I don't know who designed this thing. It's terrible engineering. But anyways, I feel really good about making some changes and improvements while this engine is out. But before we get to that in the next episode, let's rewind, see what prep I had to do to get to the dyno, and see how that first dyno session went. In the last episode, we made a number of changes as we prepped for the dyno, such as relocating our fuel pressure regulator to the rear bulkhead, and setting up our vacuum regulator for the valve cover. So we're going to pick up there and finish off a few more things. Since everyone loves a nice pair of jugs, we'll start here. And obviously, I'm talking about water to fill our intercooler system. For those not in the know, we're using a CSF water-to-air intercooler system on this build due to its serious increase in efficiency over a standard air-to-air intercooler. The only problem is, we haven't added fluids since we powered up our pumps, which gave us the ability to bleed the system properly. Because most sanctioning bodies ban the use of traditional coolant, we're going to go with some water wetter and some good old-fashioned water. But before we can get the system completely full, we've got to remove the bleeder plug that we added many episodes ago. This port on top of the intercooler is a requirement due to the fact that the intercooler itself is placed so high within the system itself, but once water comes out of that port, it means that we're good to go. Up at the front of the car, I cracked the bleeder screw on top of the CSF heat exchanger, and with water coming out there too, I feel pretty confident in saying we've got no air pockets left in the system. I'm also quite impressed with how little I spilled during this whole ordeal, and now we can cross our first thing off the list. The intercooler system is completely bled. Up next, we've got a job that isn't necessary for the dyno, but is necessary in every other aspect. You might notice the fluid is a little bit low on our reservoir, and that's due to a faulty gasket in the upper half. This was something I wanted to address before SEMA, but the gasket was on back order everywhere that I could find it. Since fluid wasn't leaking if the car didn't experience any major G-forces, I didn't have to worry about it, but after pulling the original gasket, I did find a defect on the first cylinder, so the new gasket is an easy fix. Another thing crossed off the list.
Step down.
We do have some open holes in the top of the transmission that haven't been an issue until now, when we're going to spin the transmission up to speed. The first one is really easy. It's just the reverse light switch. I tracked down the right one, and installation took only a moment. On the other hand, there is a hole on the back side of the transmission that is meant for a vehicle speed sensor. After not being able to find a sensor that actually fit in the hole, I just bought an M20 bolt, and we're going to make a plug. Using the trusty old angle grinder, I cut it down to a more appropriate length, cleaned up the end on the lathe, and then added a crush washer for a good seal. We can cross this off the list as well, but some of you guys are obviously wondering, hey, don't you need a vehicle speed sensor? Well, buried deep on the transmission, down on the side in an almost inaccessible area, is this little blue plug. There were no good angles of removal or reinstallation, so all I can do is show you the plug and the sensor that replaces it. And with that, we've got a Hall effect sensor installed on the side of the transmission. For good measure, I decided it was a good idea to check our spark plug gap and spark plug health before we head to the dyno, so I pulled cylinder number 1 and made some observations. As expected with the bass tune, this thing is running really rich, but that's easy to sort out. I checked the gap and we're reading at a good 24 thousandths, so back in it goes along with the other 3. In the last episode, we relocated our fuel pressure regulator, but we didn't relocate the fuel pressure sensor, which is located on the opposite end of the fuel rail. For the health of the sensor itself and to remove a potential leak point, I want to relocate this sensor to the fuel pressure regulator. So we pulled the line, removed the sensor housing, and reassembled. Thankfully, our TurboSmart fuel pressure regulator does include a provision for a fuel pressure sensor, so relocating the sensor itself is quite easy. But we're going to get lucky with the wiring harness too, because it's long enough to reach the new sensor location, meaning we don't have to make any modifications. This is a plug-and-play change. Our sensor's going to last longer, and we've increased our fire safety. With the fuel system apart, it's also smart for us to check our fuel filter. I want to make sure that it doesn't have any particulates from the tank or any sand from the sandblasting process that may have made its way into it. But thankfully it looks good, so we can seal it back up and reinstall the rest of the fuel system. And because we've run the engine a decent bit at this point, the last thing I want to do before we head to the dyno is to check the health of our engine. We're running Pennzoil's Ultra Platinum Full Synthetic, and our oil filter housing will allow us to see the health of the oil without actually opening the engine up. A Schrader valve on top allows us to pressurize the filter housing and force the oil through a screen. This will reveal metal particulate or bearing material in the event we're experiencing premature wear, but thankfully the Pennzoil is doing its job, and there is nothing we wouldn't expect to see in this filter housing. But to be completely thorough, I actually drained the oil in the car and took a look at what was in the catch pan. There were no shavings whatsoever, and the pearl suspended in the oil is exactly what we'd expect to see on a new engine in the break-in process. Based on what we see here, I feel really confident leaning on this engine over the next couple days while we rely on Pennzoil for protection. I tackled everything that I could think of to make sure that this car is truly ready for the dyno, and with everything crossed off the list, it was time to load it up onto the trailer for the following day. Although this load-up process does make me realize I would love an easier to load setup. Maybe an enclosed trailer if I could find the right one. Skylines galore. Finally, we are back at Animal Auto for the first time in nearly a year. It's here that we'll be working through the kinks and the teething pains, and then eventually laying down some big power as we work through the tuning process of the 244 GTK. Getting the Ferrari mounted to Animal Auto's hub dyno was not necessarily an easy task. It required removal of the housing of one side just to clear the bodywork. But with that out of the way, the car was suspended and ready for the tuning process. It's Andrew Molina that owns the shop and will be working his magic to put in the long hours that are needed to get this car running perfectly. I couldn't begin to describe what it is that he actually does as he clicks these keys, but I know that it's my job to make sure that the car is ready to hang with him. But, as one might expect, there are a lot of trials and tribulations that come with a fresh build that's completely untested, and even more so for its first day on the dyno. It's unsurprising that our first day did not go without a handful of problems, as evidenced by the extreme amount of smoke coming from my tailpipe. Off camera, we did quite a bit of diagnosing before realizing exactly what the problem was. In the last episode, I worked to fix an overflowing problem by adding a hose to our breather port of our oil scavenge tank. I was under the impression that, combined with adding some run time once the car was shut off to the oil scavenge pump itself, would keep this tank from overflowing in the future, but it turns out we've got a plumbing problem. If you look closely at the lower hose of these two, the one that feeds the pump from the tank, you'll notice that it crosses over one of the chassis rails. This high point in the line created an airlock and kept the pump from functioning properly, which meant the tank was overflowing, and as you saw on video, was then blasting out the turbo. After we rerouted the line under the chassis, it solved the problem, and then we moved on to figuring out why the cooling system wasn't cooling properly. They were plagued by an almost identical problem, an air pocket in each line as it crossed over the front wheel. We couldn't reroute those hoses, but we did work some magic to get them bled of air, and then the cooling system began to work. We also wired in some fans, and suddenly our engine temps were right where we wanted them to be. We closed down our plug gaps just a touch, and finally, the car was starting to run pretty dang well. We spent an entire day and a half on the dyno, but ultimately we were still met with one major issue. You'll have to listen for that problem, but unfortunately my microphone got peaked during this run, so it's going to sound terrible and it'll blow your speakers out. But if you listen closely in any case, you will hear what I'm talking about. The engine surges under load. That wah 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 sound is not ideal, and I'll let Andrew explain what the problem is.
So yeah, a long exciting day on the dyno. Seems like we can't load up the car pretty well. After 5500, when we really start to get into some power, the car just starts to buck on us. looking at the data here, we're looking at the RPM trace, and it looks clean. Everything looks nice and smooth, but we're jumping, you know, 600-800 RPM back and forth. This is the bucking, if you will. And our manifold pressure is looking nice and steady. I don't see any drop off or anything like that. But just the way that the car feels, it looks like we might need to investigate the clutch. And being that it's a twin disc, we may need to look at the throwout bearing and make sure that it's shimmed properly. Other than that, we had a little bit more hiccups with the cooling system, you know, getting it burped, a little more revisions, drawing board, but I think, you know, round 2, we should have all our ducks in a row.
Sweet.
Good to go. But yeah, a lot of bugs worked out. Long night, good morning, and we'll see you in a couple days.
Andrew did analyze the rest of the data along with the dynograph and confirmed we do indeed have some sort of clutch issue. Nothing in the tuning suggests any sort of problem. While I would have been excited to make some serious power numbers on the dyno, this is about how I expected our first session to go, and as said, as long as I'm willing to look at the upside, we have learned a lot. These are all expected hurdles that you would have on a fresh build like this. But the car is running better than ever, and I'm confident once we get back to the dyno, we're going to make some serious progress. But at the moment, we've got to go backwards and undo all of the progress we made in the beginning of this episode by pulling the engine out of the car. Yeah, unfortunately, the clutch job on this is an engine out service. There's no way to access it with the engine mounted into place. And to get the engine out of the car, literally everything else in the engine bay has to come out too. The dry sump system, the tank, every line, the turbo, the manifolds, front and rear, literally all of it's got to come out. So let's talk about what the potential issue is. As Andrew said, we need to check if the throwout bearing is spaced appropriately, and the throwout bearing looks something like this. It's a hydraulic one that slides over the input shaft of the transmission and presses on the fingers of the pressure plate to disengage the clutch. There does need to be an air gap between the pressure plate and the throwout bearing when your foot is not on the clutch pedal. Getting this correct does require a lot of measurements, and it's something we did in one of the previous episodes, so I feel like I got it right, but there's always a chance I messed up. If there's not enough space between these parts, we would experience clutch slip like we saw earlier in the video. But with the engine out of the car, it's pretty easy to take a peek inside, compress the slave cylinder with a screwdriver, and see what kind of gap we're actually working with. If there is a gap, we've likely got an issue with the clutch discs themselves. Now, it was borderline impossible to get a camera in there to see these parts as well as get light pointed at it, but with a bit of camera manipulation, you can make out that there is about a 100 thousandths air gap, which is what we're looking for. So let's talk about what that means. So based on what I'm seeing through that little window in the transmission originally meant for the clutch fork, is that this throwout bearing is not the problem. There is a gap present, which is what we want, and I also don't have any spacers behind this thing. I really don't think that this is our problem. We'd have to machine the back of the throwout bearing in order to add more gap. That seems kind of crazy. Clutch masters insist there's no way we should have to do that. So what comes next? Well, I'm going to pull the transmission off and actually look at the clutch disc surfaces and see what that tells us. And then I'll probably take the entire clutch and flywheel and pressure plate combo down to clutch masters and have them actually breakaway test it and see if there is an issue, because they'll have a better answer than what I'm going to come up with just kind of guessing for it. So that's what's going to be in our next episode. Then we'll get the whole thing put back together and back in the car. But in that next episode, I'm also thinking about making some other changes, some improvements while everything is apart. I don't want the car to be apart any longer than it has to be, but I don't want to miss an opportunity to make a big change while I have the clearance to do it. And what I'm thinking about is how to utilize these right here. We were talking earlier about some of the cooling system issues we were having with bleeding the whole thing. And I'm thinking about running the radiator engine coolant lines through the middle of the car instead of the intercooler, and instead isolating the entire heat exchanger intercooler system to the back of the car and putting those coolers right here, the heat exchanger, with a fan, and then using the NACA duct on the door way up there to actually route air to that cooler so that we have positive airflow through it as we're driving. Will it work? I don't know, but I think this is probably a worthwhile change. I'm gonna start kind of turning my gears, seeing what I can come up with. I think it's probably worth trying to do because it's going to make serviceability of the car a lot easier. And I think it should work just as well, maybe even better. So we're going to give that a go. I'm going to start planning that out. That'll be in our next episode. And with any luck, by next week, I can have the whole car back together, We'll get back over to the dyno, deal with some more bleeding woes, I'm sure, as we get the whole car hot. But in all, I think these are changes worth making. The car's running great otherwise. I'm excited. I'm in a good mood. It's an opportunity, right? We learn from the failures. I'm totally fine with this dyno session being a little bit of a failure, because that's where you learn the most. But with all that said, I'm done in this episode. It's been a while since I've put it on an episode. I need to get into the office and start editing and put something out for you guys. So that's a wrap. Thank you guys as always for the support. I'll catch you at the end of the week or next week.